Hey, I'm Huck, and like most of you, I got to admit, I was pretty underwhelmed by Mr. Obama's first debate performance in 4 years, going up against serial job killer Mitt Romney. Let's face it, Obama was off his game, but I suspect Obama went into this debate trying very hard to look moderate, as someone who was willing to compromise rather than look for red meat. What Mr. Obama and his debate prep team just didn't realize was that this kind of appearing like a moderate just doesn't play in the high-stakes world of cutthroat, my opponent's a Nazi political theater. And there's no bigger stage in that political theater than a presidential debate. Sure, Obama could have prepared some snappy comebacks to any number of Romney's lies and distortions throughout the debate. For instance, when Romney tried to boast that while working as governor in the state of Massachusetts with a legislature that was 87% Democrat, they managed to achieve the top performing public schools in the nation. Well, Obama could have come back and said, hey, I'd say that's a sign that the good folks in Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi ought to consider electing a whole lot more Democrats to their state legislature and get the worst performing schools in the nation fixed. Or when Romney referred to the Frank Dodd Wall Street reform bill as somehow a bad idea because it wasn't perfect. I mean, no bill that ever gets through Congress ever is perfect. But what Mr. Romney didn't mention is that many of the imperfections of that reform bill, just like Obamacare, were made at the absolute insistence of Republicans, who after they got their way, unanimously voted against both bills anyway. During the debate, Obama made the mistake of rehashing too much over what he had accomplished in the last 4 years, rather than offering a vision of what would be on his agenda in the next 4 years. Now, there are tens of thousands of teachers out of work today due to Republican state legislatures who decided to reward corporate greed and offer massive corporate tax cuts at the state level at the cost of this nation's future. But promising as Obama did to hire 100,000 new teachers over the next 4 years really wasn't what folks wanted to hear. I mean, Obama pretty much already had the teacher vote locked up, so don't waste folks' time. Question is, how will you create millions of jobs that don't involve cops, firefighters, or teachers? And the truth is, if you're talking about government jobs, one area where we could really use some folks and some more funding would be in the EPA, the Food and Drug Administration, and Wall Street regulators. Republicans in the House and Senate have so underfunded those agencies they can barely function. But folks don't understand the enormity of the problems in these areas. Like, for instance, how the Koch brothers have virtually bought every judge and government official in the region surrounding their Georgia Pacific plants, so that the massive outbreaks of cancer and lung disease and the environmental devastation that surrounds these plants has gone completely unchecked. But folks have been so barraged by the Republican mantra that government is too big and that regulations are strangling small businesses that most folks don't stop to think that it's these same Republicans repeating that are being funded by the Koch brothers, by the gas and oil industries, by the big Wall Street investment firms, and by these big food conglomerates that are poisoning our food with genetics and antibiotics that, if we ever actually had a chance to study it, would make our heads spin. But regardless of whatever approach Obama chooses to use in these final 2 presidential debates, let me offer this small tidbit of advice to President Obama and his whole debate prep team. Regardless of how the first 88 minutes of your debate goes, you still have a chance to leave a lasting impression with that final 2-minute or 3-minute or 4-minute summation at the end. So let me end this video with my version of what I think could be an effective end of the debate summation that has the dual purposes of not only energizing your base, but quite likely throwing Mr. Romney completely off of his game. And it'd be kind of fun to see him return to the blathering, stammering idiot we've come to know. And here is my version. The whole economic recovery and jobs plan offered by Mr. Romney comes down to 3 things he can guarantee. He will drastically cut taxes for the rich. He will eliminate many of the regulations we place on businesses to help keep you safe and healthy. And finally, he will end once and for all our promise that when you reach age 65, you will have guaranteed medical services. Twice, in 2001 and again in 2003, George W. Bush slashed taxes across the board in this country. But the biggest hit, the biggest loss of revenue, came from the enormous tax breaks this policy gave to the very wealthiest people in this country. Mr. Bush said that these would only last for 10 years. He also said, like Mr. Romney, that this would create millions and millions of new jobs, and that any lost revenue from these tax cuts would be more than made up by the new tax revenue created by the new jobs. The results after 10 years have been an undeniable nightmare. It's the only way to describe it. Job growth has been the worst in 50 years. The tax reductions resulted in more than $1 trillion added to the debt because no new jobs materialized and no new tax income came in to the government. Yet after 10 years, after these horrendous results, what have Republicans done? Absolutely refused to end those tax cuts. Even going so far as to threatening to shut the government down, default on our loans, in order to keep them in place. Forget that these tax cuts never did one thing they said they do. Republicans are still demanding that we keep them in place. Why? Because it was never about the jobs. It was always about the money. It always is. Now Mr. Romney comes along and wants your vote. And what's his big plan to create jobs and stimulate the economy? Even more massive tax cuts. Not only does he want to keep the failed tax cut policy put in place by Bush that should have expired, but he wants to add to that a 20% further reduction in tax rates of the very rich, which every independent economist, including the Tax Policy Center, has said will add $5 trillion to the debt. And to top it all off, the Republican budget the last 2 years, written by Mr. Romney's running mate, Paul Ryan, calls for a zero capital gains tax, which means that the 15% Mr. Romney should be paying on his humongous investment income, which, by the way, he didn't pay the full 15%, would now be zero. Well, how nice for him. What he won't tell you, what he can't tell you, because it can't be done, is that the tax deductions he says he plans to eliminate, even if he eliminated every single one, doesn't come close to offsetting the $5 trillion he plans to give away, most of that to the rich. And so he'll have no choice but to come to the middle class to make up that lost income. and to slash programs for the poor and neediest in our society. Programs for veterans, for seniors. What a nice guy. The one absolute guarantee you can take as gospel from this debate is that Mr. Romney and Mr. Ryan will cut taxes for themselves and their millionaire, billionaire friends and donors. Those cuts he can guarantee. Resulting jobs, he can't. He knows this. He's lying. Let me make this clear. The vast majority of rich and successful people in this country don't feel this way. Haven't asked for this, don't even want this. It's just a few, a tiny, tiny minority of very rich, very greedy folks who are pushing this agenda. But ever since Citizens United, it only takes a few billionaires to basically fund an entire party's agenda. And guess what, folks? Boy, have they found the party. Mr. Romney's Republican Party. Those of you who still think there's no difference between Democrats and Republicans, remember this election 10 years from now, when you're 65 years old and you no longer have guaranteed medical coverage, because all you get is a voucher that maybe covers half the cost. And even if you can afford the other half, you may have trouble finding a company that will extend a policy to you because you're too sick or too old. If Mr. Romney is elected, I have a guarantee of my own, and that is that millions and millions and millions of you are going to find some very, very tough days ahead. Not these guys, though. They'll be laughing all the way to the Cayman Islands.